Hey everybody, this is Anne. Welcome back to Painting Big. Today we are going to tackle a subject that is near and dear to my heart. The basics of paint chemistry, paint mixing, pigments, things like that, as it pertains to Reaper paint in general and MSP 2.0 in particular. I'm going to paint a little bit while we talk about this stuff, but let's get into it. Alrighty. Oh, wow. Up close and personal with the Rael bust. So what goes into paint? What is paint made of? When I got thrown into the Reaper paint department and Ed told me, hey, I want to make a new paint line to rival Vallejo, can you figure it out? And hey, you should go down to this paint store near us and you should try the colors and figure out what we're going to use and essentially do all the stuff. I knew nothing. I had a very good background in color theory and color in general thanks to my art education, but I didn't know any paint chemistry, and it quickly became evident that that was something that I at least was going to want to know. I'm the kind of person who really wants to know the why behind things and how they work. And so for me, there wasn't anything that was readily discoverable as far as like they didn't make it easy for me. I had to go out on the internet and do a lot of searches. I read a lot of articles in industry type magazines and publications. I looked up research papers on occasion, pretty much doing a dive and just Googling as much as I could until I found the facts I needed. And so what I'm going to share with you today is my basic layman's understanding. Even though I did do this for like a living as far as creating a paint line, I'm not a paint chemist. I didn't sit down for 4 years and get the degree in it. I have pretty much the information that paint chemist and chemist friends have shared with me over the years, plus the stuff that I've learned for myself. All right, disclaimer over, let's get into it. So all paint is started in a base, and a base is usually a clear or sometimes tinted with some white or black pigment type of concoction that's really just like the water and then the stuff that makes the goop that you put everything else into. So why does the goop exist? The goop exists because pigments left in their natural state will reactivate when you add water. So if you just put a puddle of pigment down on, your model and brushed it around, it would appear to dry, but when you added water, it would immediately come back up. So that's why paint products over the years have added something to fix the color. So in oil paint, the pigment is bound up in the oil, and when the oil evaporates, it also fixes the pigment. In water-based paints, though, you have to have something else to fix the pigment, because obviously when water evaporates, it just goes away. You're just left with pigment. So what we do with that is we use resins. And by resins, it's not quite what you're thinking, if you're thinking of resin 3D printing and all that kind of thing, but kind of, because resins are plastics at their core, right? The old school resins that you could see in like paint would be like acrylic, latex, vinyl. There was even styrene in the old days. Yes, the same sort of styrene that Games Workshop models are made of. Used to be a type of fixative in a paint. But nowadays, all those resins tend to be proprietary. So very few companies, I think, are using real latex in their formulations anymore. What they've done is they've gone in the lab and they've created a compound that acts like latex or acrylic or vinyl or a blend, mostly a blend, for reasons I'll talk about in a second. And they're using that. Now, the base is pretty important. Not only does it fix the pigments, but it also contributes directly to how the paint feels. So a base can be very thick, or it can be even a firm substance, like a tube paint, or artist tube paint might be a very firm paint that stands up well and leaves texture. It can be a very, very fluid paint, all the fluid acrylics that you see out there, including Reaper Master Series paint. And it also has something to do with the paint's base coverage. Now, most of the coverage in a paint is granted through pigments and their particular properties. But some bases have stuff added to them, like I think marble dust was the one that was brought up not long ago to me. Usually that'll also give you a grainy, gritty texture. So for hobby paints, it's not ideal when you're thinning and stuff. But the resin that I was just talking about is also something that can be used to give coverage, or the lack of coverage. So let's get out Exhibit A here. Do you all remember this era of Games Workshop paint? Some of you won't, some of you will. Those who use them know that these suckers stuck like crazy to your palette. Like, you had to use chemicals to get them off. But they were also really transparent. So this is a very high acrylic base. So my guess here is, just by its behavior, that the resin used in these paints was allied to or straight up acrylic. It was really hard, it was really durable, but it was also really see-through. So different resins are giving you different properties. Latex was kind of in the middle of this stuff. So if you look at your average latex house paint from back in the 1980s or whatever, latex was kind of considered kind of the best medium solution for everything. That kind of resin, if not latex itself, something that was similar, had moderate levels of both durability and coverage. So then you had paints that were used in the creation of cell animation frames. And those were what the vinyl bases and their ilk were really good at. Vinyl bases were known for very high coverage. They tend to have a goopy, plasticky texture, and they give a lot of coverage in comparison to any other base, but they are also extremely fragile. A lot of industry people I talked to never, ever, I asked them about vinyl bases, and they were like, why would you ever want that? They're making faces, because to them, the fragility, the fact that the paint would rub off or be easily scarred, was a downside that they couldn't get past. Now, all of these, as I mentioned, these days you're going to get a proprietary blend of resins that kind of mimics the action of, maybe an acrylic vinyl blend or an acrylic latex blend. And I would say, even in best possible world, in my experience, as far as the coverage goes, maybe 10 to 20% of that is your base. I would say the rest of it is pigment or other additives, depending on what company you're working with. But with Reaper, it's always just base and pigment. All right, so the vehicle is water, and then the fixative is the resin. What else is in a paint base? A whole bunch of crap, pretty much. Sometimes there are some silicates to aid in flatting, or there's paint conditioners. There can be flow improvers. There can be thickeners, as we mentioned, depending on the texture you want a paint to have or not have. And as I mentioned with the marble dust, sometimes they can also add a little bit coverage. They'll also are going to affect sometimes the finish of the paint. So once we've got our paint, then I grab, let's say I grab a big 5-gallon off of the Reaper shelf, and I shake it up, and I'm like, all right, how am I going to make MSP? I'm going to add things like paint conditioner, flow improver, flatting base, because we get our paints in their natural state. We want to add our own flattener, because our flatteners are generally much finer than the industry flatteners that I looked at. And then finally, we're adding pigments, and that is what makes paint. So the last thing I want to talk about is kind of the why. I told you I liked the why. The why behind why different resins affect coverage and durability. So it's all down to particle size, which is very similar to pigments, and we'll talk about those in a second. So I meant to paint, and I totally got all up in my own paint chemistry, but I don't want to bore you guys, so I'm going to totally work on this model while we talk about why resins cover or don't cover. Why do some paints cover better than others? As I mentioned, a lot is pigment. However, particle size makes a big difference. So when those resins are being added to that vehicle, that water base, they're being kept in a solution by a class of chemicals called surfactants. Also the same things in your dish soap that actually make it bubble. And those resins are being ground, so the resins are being ground down to fine particle size, right? But depending on the type of resin, there's a limit to how much you can grind it. So acrylic is the finest particle size. Think of it like grains of sand. Latex in the middle, or equivalents to that type of paint, are in the middle. And then the vinyl, think of that as like rocks. So sand to kind of like little tiny rocks to like more sizable rocks. And then imagine that you've taken glue and glued those things together. So you've glued your big rocks together, your little rocks together, and your sand together, like all separately, right? And let's say you're just using white glue. We're not using like super strong glue here. I also want to do a shout out to a paint chemist who once told me that white glue was pretty much indistinguishable from a paint base. Just for those of you looking for some weird factoids. But, so when you go to, like, say, take a baseball bat and try to hit that pile of stones, chances are, if you give it a good whack, those stones are going to fly apart. They don't have much surface area in contact with each other. They are, they're fairly big and irregular. They're not going to be tremendously durable. And likewise, if you try to hit a pile of sand that you've glued together, chances are your bat's going to bounce off. All those sand particles are very small, and they're fitting together pretty closely compared to the big rocks. And then the smaller rocks might be somewhere in the middle. So that's what we're dealing with durability with resins. Is essentially the acrylic has a very small particle, and so it's very strong and really resists being scraped off or wearing off. And the softest particle is the largest particle. However, that largest particle is also the one that covers the best. So you see the problem. You can't have your cake and eat it too. And all those proprietary blends that are out now are trying to let you have your cake and eat it too. So there's always the possibility that at some point someone is going to figure out some way to construct a base that gives you both the extreme high durability and the high coverage. Hasn't been done yet, but for now, we're all kind of on an either or spectrum, and most people are using blends that give you the best world that they think they can give you, right? And the reason the higher particle size covers better is that a higher particle size is going to block light filtration through the paint. So it's very intuitive. So coverage is very much dependent on particle size as far as that goes. This is also the reason why when you thin certain paints, at least it's one of the reasons, when you thin certain paints and you notice that your paint kind of collapses, your colors start to float and it goes all out of solution. So larger particle size also makes for a heavier particle size, and it's going to break the paint sooner when you add a lot of water. So essentially that particle is going to sink. Once you essentially add enough water to break the surfactant bonds, those chemicals that are holding everything together, when you add a lot of water, you essentially overbalance the mixture, and you break those bonds, and your paint falls out of solution. So, all right, all that said, all of that, how things work aside, let's talk about pigments. Just quick, I'm going to, some people have been asking, what pigments does Reaper use? Some people have asked us to put it on the paint bottles. Reaper's not interested in doing that, but if you're worried about toxicity, I can tell you which pigments we actually use, and we don't use any other different ones from this. However, first I want to talk a little bit about how pigments affect your paint base when you put them in. So, relative amount of pigment, relative to the base, so how much pigment you're putting in relative to the amount of your base, affects the feel and viscosity of the paint. More pigment tends to feel a little bit creamier. It can also make the paint viscosity feel a little more loose, a little less thick. Another interesting factoid for y'all is that every base has a pigment ceiling. And what that means is that you can't just keep adding pigment forever. Eventually, you're going to hit that ceiling, and if you try to put more pigment in, your paint will not dry. Or if it does dry, you're going to find that it rubs off very easily, because essentially at that point you've overwhelmed, the resin count has gotten out of balance with the pigment count, and you have killed your adhesion. So there are limits that we all have to adhere to when we're mixing colors. All right, so let's talk pigment. Reaper's red pigment is a naphthol red. We don't use cadmiums. That includes our high density. Our high density red is also a naphthol red. Our yellows, we have two yellows we use. They are Hansa. One is Hansa and one's, I believe, is a Hansa and diarylide. I never know how to say that dang word. Yellow. The orangey one is the mixture, the blend. Our yellow, our straight yellow, the elemental yellow, in fact, for the new paint line, is a Hansa yellow. Not a cadmium. Our green is a phthalo green. Both of our blues, we have both a green shade and a red shade, and both of them are phthalo. Our magenta is quinacridone, and it's the more transparent one. I know they're somewhere out there are higher coverage quina magentas, but we are using the standard quinacridone magenta. which means it is quite low coverage, but very intense, beautiful color. If you wonder, by the way, why certain companies might use different pigments than others, one of the reasons is cost. To get a real Pyrrole red, or like some of the fancier blue or like magenta pigments, you're going to have to pay a little bit more, and then that means you have to pass that on to your customer. So Chimera is probably the place. If you want fancy pigments, go to Chimera. They kind of have, I think they've got a cobalt teal. They've got some other really interesting colors. But for Reaper, we kept it simple. We wanted to keep it simple and non-toxic, and to still offer good quality while making it as cost-friendly as well to you guys as we could. I'm pretty happy with the quality of our paint. I use it to paint pretty much everything I do. Although I try other paint lines from time to time, I always go back to MSP. That said, let's continue on, because there are a few more. Our white is a titanium white. Our black is a lamp black. We also have a more transparent lamp black that we use in our liner base. And then I think the only thing left, looking at my list, the only thing left are our browns. Our browns and earth colors are all iron oxides. So we've got a red, a yellow, and 2 browns. One reddish brown oxide, and one that's more of a raw umber type color brown oxide. Yeah, all of this is lab synthesized. All of this is synthetic pigments. So we don't use cadmiums or cobalts or leads or any weird pigments. We stick to the straight up stuff. We use a high quality colorant. It's not cheap. But we also aren't looking to use anything exotic. Our aim and goal is to create a solid, high-quality hobby paint line that can do everything you need it to do. And hopefully, once you guys get your hands on MSP 2.0, you'll agree that we've taken a pretty good swing at that. All right, guys, this is where I'm going to let you go. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I know it's a little bit weird. People don't get on the internet and talk about paint chemistry and hobby paints, but we just did, so here you go. For everybody who has been secretly wanting this, I hope you had fun. Thanks so much, and this is Anne signing off.